Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. Whilst much of the attention around the world over recent weeks may have been on the United States as Donald Trump's second term as president takes shape, China, of course, also remains well worth keeping an eye on. It is, after all, New Zealand's key trade partner, the world's second biggest economy, and has a growing presence around the world. To discuss China, I'm joined again by David Mahon, the China-based New Zealander who is Managing Director of Mahon China Investment Management, which is an investment manager and corporate advisor. David, who's currently in New Zealand, joins me in the studio. Hi, David, and welcome back to the Of Interest podcast. Great to see you again.
Thanks, Gareth.
So look, I thought we'd kick off with a very interesting meeting that was reported out of China yesterday with President Xi Jinping meeting with many of the biggest names in Chinese business, representing industries such as chip making, EVs, electric vehicles, and artificial intelligence or AI. Even Jack Ma, the co-founder of Alibaba, was there, and obviously he was a bit of a casualty in 2020 when he tried to have an initial public offering of his company Ant. Reports suggest that Xi was upbeat and positive, and he gave an encouraging speech and was shaking hands with all these entrepreneurs and business leaders. So, looking in from afar, it looks like maybe this is a new chapter in the relationship between the government and the private sector. I'm just wondering, what's the take in China, and how significant indeed is this, and the publicity around this, and what might be behind it?
It is important. It's not a recovery of something that was lost in 2020. The myth is that Jack Ma had said things that were critical of the government and therefore his listing was sabotaged. Actually, they were heading for Ant for some time because his business Alibaba had become immensely powerful. It had moved into the area of antitrust, which is a deep concern to the Chinese government. And they were also trying to get into the financial sector through the back door. And the links are consumer finance and all the things that come around a business like Alibaba. So that was the reason that the listing was sabotaged or was withdrawn or stopped. Of course, the government wasn't happy that a major tech entrepreneur, particularly one so famous in the West, had criticized the government. But that was a sidebar. We as Westerners focused on that more. And we also spent the next 2 or 3 years saying that the Chinese government is anti the private sector, is anti the tech sector because it's a threat to its power, which is plainly not true. China is beginning to lead the world in many technology sectors. We hear the story of EVs, solar panels, wind power. There's a whole range of others, and we'll talk about DeepSeeks later. And also Jack Ma is important, but he's not some icon in all of China and all of China business. He is important. He's a pioneer and he's widely respected. But his sidelining, and he didn't disappear, I think he went off to Canada to start with, was something that was noticed, but it was not seen as a signal of anything fundamental in terms of a change within the Chinese economy. So all governments and politicians signal things, and the meeting yesterday was political signaling on behalf of Xi and his party.
Yeah, and you mentioned DeepSeek there. Now, obviously DeepSeek has sort of taken the West by storm in recent weeks, months perhaps, certainly around the world of AI and technology with the emergence of its large language model. How much excitement is there in China about DeepSeek, the country's technology sector, I guess more broadly? Are there more DeepSeeks out there that some of us in the West perhaps should have been looking for in the past, let alone now?
The general view of China in the last 5 years, particularly the last 3 years, is that China is a threat to something about us in the West. We conflate an exaggerated human rights issue in Xinjiang. There is an issue in Xinjiang, especially on the southern border. It's 2.5 times the size of France. I was there a few months ago. I've been there a couple of times in the last 2 years, and much of it is peaceful. And it's not a gulag. There are not millions in prison. This is all fake news. But China does some bad things, and it does some clumsy things. and the way they handle ethnic minorities in China is not always great. The way they went too far in trying to sort Hong Kong out showed a lack of proportion, perhaps. And so Western countries say these things matter a great deal, and we must punish China for doing stuff that's so against humanitarian values. Our humanitarian values, such as there were 1 million people dead in Iraq from an illegal war, the Iraq War, the abandonment of Afghanistan. I mean, you can't compare one country's sins to kind of justify another's, but China's just a very big country and sometimes will do dumb stuff, as America does dumb stuff, or Europe for that matter. So in general terms, we have basically swallowed in New Zealand the Western media's position, driven very much by Washington, that China's bad and will take something from us. It's quite an abstract thing what it is that China's taking from us. In essence, for New Zealand, because of China, we barely had the same depth of loss and pain in the Great Recession that most other countries had because of our focus on trading with China. Also, China offers New Zealand a tremendous economic future because it is our major trading partner, and our economies and what we produce is very compatible with what China needs, and we can buy their stuff under the free trade agreement. But this almost existential sense that we'll lose something, so let's challenge these people. I don't live in New Zealand, and I'm told, and it's correct, particularly by my family, that having opinions about New Zealand too strongly, you've got to be a bit careful. But I look at European New Zealanders like me talking about Maori issues, and it's like we're afraid of losing something in the process that has been the Maori Renaissance. No one can really put their finger on what it is. So these things are cultural. And in a much greater scale, that's what's occurring between the West and China. So we've stopped watching, we've stopped listening, we have been consumed with our own abstract anxieties. China's full of DeepSeeks. There are companies in China, the names of which we just have never heard of, that are about to change major sectors that influence our lives. You know, Huawei, that we very foolishly and without any foundation blocked back in those days in the last government to build our telecommunication system, was blocked by a number of countries under great pressure from Washington. Huawei has flourished since. It's got workarounds. Its phones are amazing. So most things that have been blocked in China have become stronger, especially in the technology sector. So DeepSeek is like the first, I don't want to say shot across the bows because it makes a sort of military metaphor, but it is a flare, a signal. This is what China's been focused on in the last 10 years, getting away from making nylon socks and teddy bears and cheap stuff and making really good technology, really sophisticated technology. And so this is what's going to come out of China now in waves and make all our lives cheaper in terms of buying stuff that's important to us. And it's going to be a major challenge to the major tech companies of the West, creating the kind of competition that, you know, markets run on, innovation's driven by. So this should be perceived as a positive thing.
It's really interesting. I mean, we'll look out for more tech companies in China. Broadly speaking, like looking at the Chinese economy at the moment, what's the outlook, do you think, well, as 2025 gets underway? We're in February, so a bit of it's gone already. And especially from the perspective of New Zealand trade and businesses who have an interest in China.
Potentially, the next 2 to 3 years for New Zealand should be very good in China. China has still a great need for protein. China also wants to buy seafood. China's focus on fibre, despite the downturn in the construction sector, is still there. So our logs are still selling reasonably in China. There are many things that New Zealand and China could do together. But we've been trying to get away from China, not just this government, but the previous one, by our own version of decoupling and our own confusion of where we stand as a nation. Where do we sit in history? What are we really? Are we, as I fear a lot of influential Australians think, the last bastion of some Judeo-Christian more exceptional white people on the other side of the world, surrounded by people who aren't? Or are we a modern country fulfilling our geographical destiny, which is to be an Asian Pacific economy with a deeply multicultural society? Yes, the dominant culture is people that have come from the UK as immigrants over the years, but already this country is beginning to change. Do we go on changing in that way? So we all become New Zealanders who are about the present and the future and the fact we're human beings, not that we might be Chinese or Indian or African? Or do we cling to this residual sense that we were once superior, so we're still superior? There's something about our systems that are morally better than those systems in other cultures, perhaps non-Christian cultures. So there's an instinctive issue that has been driving New Zealand in the wrong direction. Our immigration is a shameful scandal. If you are African, Indian or Chinese, it costs close to $400 to get a visa to come here. You may never ever get your visa processed. We have withdrawn the right for you to apply in your own language. Most people visit New Zealand without a visa. So we've kept those people out. Is that a racial issue? Well, immigration's been told about this for some time now. It hasn't changed. Then we get an announcement that very rich people can come and how open we are. What does that matter? I talk to medium-sized Chinese businesses who are invested here and they can't get visas. They give up trying to come. The Chinese students that we really need to help fill especially our tertiary institutions and even our high schools, to create the kind of cash flows that a small country like New Zealand struggles to generate from its own population. That process is being truncated. It's racist, it's exceptionalist, and this and the last government should be ashamed they allowed this to take place. I don't like the term deep state, but every country has a little bit of deep state, where a bunch of people with a very determined view can make a lot of things happen. The rest of us don't know, and our hapless politicians often aren't that aware of what's happening. So we've got a great future in trade with China, but we're facing some major issues. We tried to slip a ship into the Straits of Taiwan with the Americans last year. Very sadly, that ship in the end foundered and sank in Samoa. But this thing of joining the American alliance, let's play with the big boys now and it will give us some power, reflected glory. If we go on doing that, eventually we will be cut out by China. We're in violation in many ways already of our free trade agreement. We're a country of diplomatic infidelity. And for most of my life, we've been the opposite of that. Under Helen Clark, John Key, Jim Bolger, we were the country that was respected. Now people are scratching their heads and saying, what's wrong with New Zealand? It seems to have lost its sincerity, its sense of loyalty.
A couple of really interesting things I want to pick up on here. The recent issue with, I guess, China's comprehensive strategic partnership with the Cook Islands. But before we come to that, in terms of trade from a New Zealand perspective, there has been a lot of talk about diversifying. Do we have all our eggs in the China basket? Should we try and grow trade elsewhere? And I did a podcast on this topic about where and with who, and the options were quite tough in many parts of the world. One of which is India, which of course is a massive country like China, growing economy, and Prime Minister Christopher Luxon is going there in March, and he's hung his hat on, quite a bit really on trying to do a free trade deal with India. How are things like that perceived in China?
If the Prime Minister had gone to China and conferred upon it as a great power the respect it deserved in the last year or so of his tenure, it'd be fine. But it's almost a statement of, again, a diplomatic insult, that not going to China before going to India. I mean, Helen and John went to China almost every time they got elected.
Jacinda Ardern went as well.
In the end, she went once. But very few in her government went. And she had little to do with China. And this pulling back isn't just the current government. A lot of it sits very much on the shoulders of the previous government. So I don't see this as a party issue. I see this as a political, cultural issue. Diversification, yes. So we downgraded our position of trade commissioners from NZTE in China. That's not diversification. Diversification is something you do through growth. When your company is already engaged in a country where everyone's making money, you stay there. And you make an effort to go to places where there are big markets we're not tapped into yet. Indonesia is a phenomenal market. I was there over Christmas. India, I go nearly every year and have for the last 15, 20 years. It's an extraordinary place, but they're difficult markets. They're difficult because of the lack of unity between the provinces, or in India's case, the states. So whatever Delhi says, will the states be able to deliver on those? They're protectionist against themselves. So however hard he tries, I think it'll be very hard for the Prime Minister to get a deal of substance. I mean, we couldn't even get a free trade deal with Europe, who's supposed to be all about our own values, and we
did in the end.
We got it, but it wasn't very big, and it excluded the things that probably mattered most. Amongst those was dairy. So if he can come back with a big deal for Fonterra and the other dairy companies, great. But I don't think he can, because India will correctly, as a developing market, defend their own dairy sector, because they can't afford to have those people with 4 or 5 cows lose their livelihood. So they'll protect those people, and they should. So I think it's going to be one of those situations where we'll get something, but I doubt we're going to get much. And I would argue this is almost as much of a message to Washington as it is a trip in search of trade for New Zealand.
Interesting. So onto the Cook Islands. So that's been a really fascinating development. So obviously Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown has recently been to China and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership in Beijing with China. And obviously you'll be well aware of having been in New Zealand for a couple of weeks now, that this has ruffled the feathers of Winston Peters, the Foreign Minister, who says both he and the Cook Islands people were kept in the dark. And I mean, Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister, has weighed in saying that Cook Islands should have consulted New Zealand. Obviously, they have this free association relationship with New Zealand, and Cook Islanders carry New Zealand passports, and New Zealand is supposed to have a role in foreign affairs and defence and security. So I guess what I'm interested in asking you about is, you mentioned that New Zealand ship that went into the Taiwan Strait. Should New Zealand look at this and see this as a bit of an insult from China directed at us?
No, I don't think it should. And I think China actually, and I know from my conversations in Beijing, I don't have very high-level contacts, but I do talk to people who are involved in Pacific and America's policy. No, there's actually the opposite is really what China is determined to do, is to make sure that it retains this relationship with New Zealand, although New Zealand is struggling in many ways to hold up its end. And I don't know the situation in the Cook Islands well. I'm aware of the first Belt and Road deal that was done in the Cook Islands, which was a irrigation system or a water system for improving the water delivery on the island. And it was done in good faith by both governments. I understand the Chinese contract company then lowered the this is hearsay, I don't know it, but I'm told that it appears that they lowered the specifications. And so the system partly collapsed. And a lot of money was spent, part of it New Zealand money, putting it all back together again. Very unfortunate event. But a country like the Cooks does need more money than we can give them. And despite America's great claims of returning to the Pacific to keep China out, they aren't really. They're not giving support to these small nations in the way that if they wanted to have real influence, they could. But it does strike me as poor diplomacy and clumsy politics on the part of Cook Islands not to inform New Zealand. They don't have to ask permission, but one could argue that a lot has been given to the Cook Islands from New Zealand. And there's a kind of cool thing. I was there a few years ago. It's a beautiful place. There are Cook Islanders in New Zealand. That kind of coming together of nations is a very positive thing. When we shouldn't be too peevish that they want to do a deal with someone with more money than us, but there clearly is some mishandling politically. In the end, China is going to invest throughout the Pacific where it can. Part of it is that it wants to express its influence. America is doing everything it can to establish its influence. At least it's not putting missiles and parking ships there, whereas Japan, Philippines, Korea bristles with THAAD missile systems which are directed at China. The American Navy and Air Force graze Chinese airspace and sea lanes all the time. It's almost the brink of war. That's how bad it is. So the thing in the cooks, an investment in the cooks under the terms as I understand them, is not a provocation. It's just embarrassing for us and perhaps clumsy of them, but I don't think we should give it too much agency.
One of the issues that's been discussed is seabed minerals research. Indeed, the Cook Islands contingent, when they went to China, apparently met with Chinese officials and looked at, talked about the possible of deep sea mining of things perhaps like nickel and cobalt. Is this something that will interest China, do you think? Is that a part of their interest in that area?
Definitely. If, again, you go back to the technological revolution, which is really what's occurring in Chinese manufacturing, they need these minerals very much. It's also interesting, I connect it with a move I perceive, it's my own guessing, but as the Trump presidency became a clear reality, China began to behave differently across Asia. I understand rather than confront Washington or react to Washington, they wanted to fix anywhere where relationships were not good. So we had this rapprochement of sorts on the India-China border, where both armies now have different protocols, so they won't bump into each other. And you can argue who was aggressor, and there's quite a complex situation, but there is peace on that border. They've just signed a protocol in Indonesia over disputed waters. And they also include undersea minerals, which are very important to China. China's going to exploit them with Indonesia. They've done this joint deal for generations, I understand, plus fisheries access. So where possible, China's trying to get deals like this where there is tension. And why wouldn't they try and get deals like this where these minerals exist further afield? China is actually very poor in resources. Given it's a huge country with such a massive landmass, it doesn't have good supply of fossil fuels. It lacks copper. It lacks many of the core minerals that really go into its industry. So it's always ranging around the world trying to find sources. And it knows that Washington will stop it wherever it can from sourcing from perhaps more traditional places. So I think we'll find it exploring many parts of the world where such minerals exist.
It's a good segue into the next topic, really, which is the China-US relationship, which is obviously this is the two behemoths of the world, certainly from an economic perspective. Now, obviously, it's Trump 2.0 time now, and we are sort of beginning to learn what Trump 2.0 is going to mean and how it may differ from the first time he was president. So one thing that hasn't differed is that there's tariffs flying around the place, obviously from the US directed at China, including a blanket 10% tariff on all Chinese imports to the US. And obviously China has responded in kind with some border taxes, tariffs of its own on US products. I mean, this has flow-on effects to small countries like New Zealand, the whole global economy. What is your expectation on how China's going to play this? Beyond, obviously, what we've already seen.
Right. I don't really know, because I thought, and I wrote at the end of last year, that the one thing about Trump is that he'll focus very much on the domestic situation in America. He doesn't have the stomach for the kind of imperial gestures or forays that perhaps other presidents might have had. And I was entirely wrong. I mean, he first talked about annexing Panama, Canada,
Greenland.
I mean, invading Mexico.
The Gaza Strip. I mean, it's extraordinary.
So take what I say next with a grain of salt, because I got that wrong. What I do think, though, is that Trump is about chaos. Trump has some of the aspect of a fascist. I think we get too loose with these terms. He's a communist, he's a fascist. But there are some features there. There certainly is the major feature of a populist. And my view is that populists go into dismantle to create as much noise and prominence for themselves as they can, because they got the power by being a rather clamorous voice and getting lots of people to come around them saying, yes, this person will act, they'll fix all my problems and they'll resolve my own anger and disgruntlement. So he's doing that at the moment. The number of things he'll follow through on is hard to say, but seeding chaos is bad for everybody. And when you turn on your closest allies first, you know there is something fundamentally wrong in the thinking, not just of him, but those around him. I think New Zealand's official position on this is complacent and wishful thinking, because even if we are not hit by tariffs, let's say our beef faces higher tariffs and we have some very good premier beef sales into the US market, or our dairy trade, which isn't huge, but it's not insignificant, also faces greater barriers than it already does. And by the way, America has always been the least accessible free market country. It's a fortress crenellated with tariffs. And so let's not have any illusions here. You get in there in premium products, and there are many areas where one can do well in the States, but there are much better markets for New Zealand to access. So I think just the chaos, the kind of mutual or retaliatory tariffs that even Europe starts to throw up is going to be bad for New Zealand because it's bad for world trade.
Yeah, and I mean, it's obviously we're only just in the early days of the Trump administration, or the second Trump administration. So who knows what is around the corner. But I guess the danger for New Zealand is sort of getting caught in the crossfire, potentially being directly targeted by tariffs, but we don't know yet. But I guess from China's perspective, and you talked before about them, doing deals with India and Indonesia, the Cook Islands one. So they're sort of, is there a real opportunity, I guess, from an economic perspective, but also from a geopolitical perspective for China, given that Trump takes this chaotic sort of approach and confuses everybody? Are there real opportunities for China? And also because he is more inward focused, even though, as you say, he's talking about Greenland and other places.
I like that joke on social media that Australia had offered New Zealand for sale, trying to take advantage of the current climate. If it were not for the fact that many in Washington want an early war with China before China gets too strong, China would benefit greatly from this. But that is what is happening. I don't think it's imminent. I do not think it's going to, at this point, occur around Taiwan. But America wants to do one of those, undertake one of those actions that kind of shows China that its military isn't ready, which it isn't, has little experience, and it certainly has very little experience. Its last conflict was an invasion of north of Vietnam in 1979. They lost 40,000 people. It lasted a month and they withdrew. You would argue from a military perspective it wasn't a very successful foray, although after that the Vietnamese stopped crossing the Chinese border and all conflict stopped on the Vietnamese border. So China says this was the purpose and they did well. But objectively, that's all they've had as an experience. So any unprepared military is not going to do well in their first engagement. The Americans didn't when they first went into North Africa. Then they did marvelously later because they're a good military nation. So I think this is the pressure that whatever good may come of the disorder that America seeds amongst its allies and amongst its adversaries, that pressure is always going to be a caveat. I think China will benefit in some ways, but chaos is chaos. Even the so-called resolution that is being pumped for by America in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, trying to bring about a ceasefire or stop the war, is any cessation of those hostilities is good for everybody, as long as it holds. And what does it cost to hold it? And someone always wins better than others when you do a deal like that. Maybe Russia gives Russia breathing space. Perhaps they feel that this is a sign of Western weakness and have other territorial ambitions. Moldova, perhaps. These things have to be considered. So I think we have to be a little careful when we forecast the benefits that China will get because America is going to fall out with so many other countries. The best thing China can do is not much at all and sit this out and not be opportunistic. The best thing China can do is not enter into tit-for-tat tariff wars. Put some down, show some form, then back off, because in the end, tariffs are tax on oneself, especially a regressive tax when you look at society and the people in society that can afford to consume things. Also, New Zealand could learn very much from an approach like that. Let's stop making any statements. We have long-standing traditional relationships with Australia, the United States, many countries in Europe and Britain. And within those, there are some very powerful things that are very precious. Concepts of democracy, rule of law, transparency, freedom of the media and press. Those things are vital to our lives. And we should respect how those are shared by these countries. But we're not allies of anyone except we have an agreement of mutual self-defense with Australia. Let's stay non-allied. Don't get allied with China either. Let's stay where we are and let's maintain our political agency by not allying ourselves too closely with anybody. So we can refer to international law when there's an issue, because international law is all we've got. We are a country with very little political agency. So stomping around Washington saying we might join AUKUS 2 or making statements that are too aggressive around what the Cook Islands are doing, and I agree, there's a lot of issues here and the Cooks could have thought it through better. But let's be careful because it looks like we're trying to behave a bit like these other countries that we actually don't approve of. We didn't go to the Iraq War. We're not a country that likes to bully and coerce others, but we have had a history of doing so. People forget that at the end of the First World War, we basically got Samoa and they wanted independence and we strafed villages from biplanes. We shot people because we were then an extension of the British Empire. We've got to be very, very careful when we get upset about the Solomons or even in this case, the Cooks, because we don't have that imperial gene. It's not part of the way New Zealanders see themselves and it's not where we're going. So let things go and don't do or say too much, not out of fear or cowardice, but out of our own certainty of knowing who we are and knowing where our interests lie.
Just finally, I just wanted to pick up on that point you made about Chinese being concerned about potential attack by America. So one of the concerns expressed in the West often is China attacking Taiwan. And I did see recently there was a Financial Times report about some big bunkers being built in China and some concern expressed that Chinese hierarchy might be preparing for a potential war. I mean, how seriously should we worry about a major war involving China and the US?
We must not discount it because it is such a ghastly concept to think about. China doesn't want a war. China doesn't want to invade Taiwan. If China were to invade Taiwan, it would be out of the global financial system within hours. China within 6 months would face a massive economic crisis. All China wants is for the West, for the US to stop trying to leverage Taiwan away from China. Taiwan is a part of China that was returning to China, but was interrupted by the Korean War. Then it became the aircraft carrier in the Cold War for the United States. Taiwan is a remarkable place. It came out of an authoritarian rule to a democracy that was quickly highly functional. It's an extraordinary place of freedom. It's well educated. It's got many great qualities. The hope is that some federated solution will come, but only if Taiwan and China are left alone to discuss that for themselves will it ever happen. The problem of the Taiwan situation is that although America spent a generation, 2 generations, acknowledging the one China policy, where they all acknowledge, this is from the Shanghai Accord, that it is an inalienable part of China, but they want a peaceful solution in terms of the differences. We've signed up to that too. The thing is to leave it alone. The strategic ambiguity of the Taiwan situation is the best defense for anyone having any unwanted conflict. So at the moment, I do not rank Taiwan as the major issue. One, America can't garrison it quickly enough if they wanted to. And I doubt that China believes it can invade it easily. It's 6 times, I think, the English Channel. And in the landings in D-Day, they needed, I think, 5 times the forces against those that were on the shore. Bunkers in China are defensive. If bunkers were being built, in parts of Indonesia or some other part of Asia, Chinese bunkers, that's not good. But I wouldn't ascribe too much significance to bunkers in China. So the real issue here is dealing with the decline of American influence in Asia and hoping that it remains a relatively smooth process. Half the world's GDP is now in Asia. Most of the growth engines of the future global economy come out of Asia. So we want that to be a peaceful place, not a place of conflict.
Look, well, thanks so much, David, for that. That's David Mahon, the Managing Director of Mahon China Investment Management in China, who's currently visiting New Zealand. Thanks again. That was really interesting, very thought-provoking, I thought. And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.